And we're live.
Okay, we are back here in a joint hearing with the Senate Education Committee and the House Education Committee, continuing our background education on the system as it is today in Vermont, pluses, minuses, and all that. Today we're going to focus on Vermont's education governance system, which is highly complex. It's less complex than it used to be, but just this morning, we were having a big discussion in our committee about unified union school districts, just to get a sense which are called compliance. It's a complex world out there. Anyway, we have folks back from the AOE. Please introduce yourselves and the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. I'm Zoe Saunders, Secretary of Education.
Emily Simmons, General Counsel.
Jill Briggs Campbell, Interim Deputy Secretary of Education.
That's their side. Okay. Go ahead. So give us an overview.
Okay, great. So thank you again for having us. I really appreciate this opportunity. Today we'll talk about the governance of education in the state of Vermont. We'll start by giving you an overview of the current governance structure. I believe that the committees have already had an orientation to this, and so this will be a recap. Then we'll walk through some of the changes in governance over the past several years. And the bulk of our presentation will be focusing on the roles and responsibilities of the different entities that oversee education in the state of Vermont. And we'll conclude by sharing a little bit of a reflection of where we've been as an agency of education and where we're headed as we're developing our strategic plan.
Okay, I'm gonna look for people to nod a lot to the extent that you've heard this already and pause frequently for questions, because I think this might be a good discussion opportunity for anything you've heard about governance all week. So you've seen this slide before, a reminder that we have 51 supervisory unions or supervisory districts, which encompass 118 individual school districts, 287 public schools, and just over 80,000 public school students. So to go back in time a little bit to 2010 is where I like to start. It's when the state started focusing for the policy matter on, I'll say, updating the state system of school district governance. And the first chapter in those updates was in 2010 with an act called Act 153, which was where the General Assembly announced that the policy was to encourage and incentivize voluntary merger activity by school districts joining with their neighbors to form larger school districts. The other part of that bill required supervisory unions to take on more responsibility with common duties across member school districts. So sort of the most high profile change was that supervisory unions became the central office for special education services, also food service, really any kind of contract was moved to the supervisory union level. So we've had those duties more or less stable for supervisory unions since 2010. Then in Act 156 was a second policy encouragement to see voluntary merger of school districts across the state, this time with some money on the table as reimbursement for fees for consultants who would help guide school districts through those merger conversations. And then finally, in 2015, the General Assembly passed Act 46, which was intended to improve education outcomes and equity by really creating larger and more efficient school governance structures. And Act 46 is where we got really specific about the types of preferred structures that the state governance should encompass and gave higher incentives for voluntary merger and then consequences and state action in the absence of some voluntary mergers.
Yeah, quick question here.
I read ahead and I was wondering, it doesn't seem like there's any kind of summary of the net effect on those three acts. Is there anything to indicate that they had a positive or negative or neutral effect?
Oh, so I have numbers, but I don't, in this slideshow, characterize the qualitative outcome. No, I was focusing on the number of units going down over the years.
Just to clarify your question around evaluating the outcomes in terms of quality and performance, or in terms of the actual output of governance structure?
The actual output, the net effect. Okay, so it's there.
Just to.
Yeah, so in terms of the numbers, we have it on this slide.
This is somebody who's was through it, Act 153, 156 didn't really result in mergers, maybe a couple,
A couple, yeah.
and then Act 46 was sort of to make it all happen.
So the Act 46's final implementation stage, we call the final state board order. That is where the State Board of Education had the authority to order school district mergers. So after that stage, overall, we saw the merger of 45 districts and 39 towns to form 11 new union school districts. Enlargement of 3 pre-existing union school districts, a net reduction of 34 school districts, with conditional requirements for an additional 4 districts to merge. That was, where there were MUDs in place, which you've already talked about, is a little more complicated. So here's the grand total from 2010 to 2020 that, and the numbers are here, I don't have to go through all of them, but that we formed 50 new union school districts with a net reduction of 156 school districts. The result being that 63% of students live in a union school district created by one of those acts. And that a little over 84% of students reside in a union school district formed through governance reform, or they already did prior to these 3 acts. So questions about the governance changes, I can go back to these numbers just in case. So I wanted to point out that school board duties have not been amended in large part as a result of these acts and are the same school board duties regardless of the size or type of the school district. Again, I think you've been over this a lot, that those duties are distinct from the duties of maybe the same people who also serve on a supervisory union board. So school board duties are listed here. They are really charged with the overall mission for education in the district, guiding decision-making consistent with that vision, measuring performance toward that vision and the learning goals for the district, establishing and maintaining local policies that encompasses policies that are mandated by law, which there are many, and also policies that just are prudent in the judgment of the school board. They employ and supervise 1 employee, which is the superintendent. They hold the superintendent accountable for developing and executing on the strategy and goals that they've set. They evaluate the superintendent's performance and they negotiate contracts with all district employees.
Robert.
Thank you. Just a quick question, wondering if, school board members, do they get formal training or any training? Okay,
Required by law, but chairs.
okay.
Yeah,
I
the
never thought
law
about that.
requires joint training for school board chairs and superintendents together.
Oh.
As mandated.
Worth pointing out that there is no enforcement mechanism and schedule or humans with scheduling issues, and it often doesn't happen.
Okay.
Thank you. As a chair who failed to do the training.
There is no jail for that.
You're slapping your own hand.
Okay, so the employee that we have, the superintendent's responsibilities, the superintendent by law acts as the CEO of the school system, whether that's a superintendent in a supervisory district with 1 board or a superintendent in a supervisory union with many boards, the same duties. So for each of their school districts, they're responsible for operational oversight, management, programs, resources, people, developing an education plan that is aligned with the school board's mission, ensuring quality of education and equities of opportunities across the system, ensuring compliance, both with state regulations and the policies set by the school board, being the supervisor for all non-licensed staff and providing recommendations to the board for positions that require a license. Creating a robust, comprehensive local assessment system and providing reports to the district and to the Agency of Education. So just a reminder, this is sort of a recap, that school boards are accountable to their voters as democratically elected officials. They're subject to the laws and rules and regulations of the state. Or the superintendent, I like to say the superintendent is the bridge to the state. The superintendent is accountable to the school board and to the state for operating within statute and regulations. Superintendents are licensed individuals. It's helpful to keep in mind that there's a lot of tension in the job, clearly. They are accountable to follow state law and lawful directives of the Agency of Education as a matter of their professional license. Any professional licensed educator can be subject to actions against their license for failing to follow the law. So it's a really hard job, I think, is what I would summarize it as. So, moving on, in entities that have governance responsibilities for education in the state, of course, we have the State Board of Education, which is 10 appointed members, including 2 students who are appointed by the governor. Historically, the State Board of Education has all the regulation, the rulemaking for education topics. They are specifically enumerated in statute. They include this list here. The State Board of Education currently has all rulemaking for the state except for the district quality standards. That was the first time the General Assembly gave rulemaking authority to the agency rather than to the State Board, since Act 98 made the Agency of Education accountable to the governor and the State Board appointed by the governor. That's fancy, the rule, baby. So to get to us, the Agency of Education, like the State Board, has a large number of specifically enumerated duties rather than walk you through where those are listed throughout Title 16. I'll point out what we view as the most high leverage of the Agency of Education's duties. So first, what might come to mind is that we are the sole state agency by statute for administering education funds from the federal government. Second, the Secretary of Education is responsible for identifying the educational goals for the education system and evaluating performance against those goals, as well as overseeing compliance with all laws that apply to schools, education laws, all the regulations of the State Board, and all federal regulations. The agency also administers statewide educational data and reporting to any number of bodies, of course, including the General Assembly. And then finally, as we mentioned earlier, the agency licensed all professional educators in the state. That's a good place to pause with questions about roles and responsibilities of anybody, state board, agency.
Yeah, sure. So going back to the school boards versus in relationship to superintendents, is there any type of, is there any legislation that controls or outlines or guides the number of school boards in a geographic area or number of towns or anything like that? Is there anything that we need to reflect on?
So our statutes have a robust system of election laws for school districts, and you would use those statutes right now to change the composition of school districts in the state. That's an electoral process as currently set up in our statutes. Supervisory unions, I think you've heard, are very different. They are administrative units. They're not tied to an electorate that votes. They are designated actually by the State Board of Education. So either on petition or on its own initiative, the State Board of Education could amend the boundaries of a supervisory union and change the member districts that constitute a supervisory union. So those are going to distinct depending on which unit you're talking about. Then within a school district, it's a municipality. So any number of features of how it governs itself can be changed. Some of those by statute are given to the board to decide for itself, the school board, and some of those are given only to the electorate to vote on. Does that answer your question?
So we wanted to transition to talk about the overall system. So far, we've provided testimony regarding our current education funding system. We've talked about some of the quality measures. We've now walked through governance. And we want to highlight some of the system issues that we're seeing in our state. And it's important that we have this as a framing as we move forward with developing, or you all are developing policy to address the issues. We've repeatedly talked about the fact that the challenges that we're facing are complex and that they will require a multifaceted approach that addresses both governance and also scale and that both of those things need to be looked at as it relates to promoting educational quality. And so what we see are some broader system issues as we're looking at the public education system as a whole. So we have a highly complex school board governance structure to serve a relatively small number of students compared to other states and also compared to other districts of our size in other states. We tend to have a top-heavy organizational structure. Because of that governance, you have a number of central office staff to oversee each of those supervisory unions, and that creates redundancy and also limits the opportunity for resource sharing across supervisory unions and districts. We've talked about the challenge of the workforce and being able to fill the jobs that we are trying to recruit for. It's also important to talk about that in terms of positioning the right staff expertise at the right level in the state's education system. So when you think about the challenge of hiring a special education director, for example, and that there's a shortage of people that in our state have that skill set, we need to be mindful about where those positions are placed. Does it make sense for that position to be placed overseeing 100 students, 400 students? Does it make sense for that position to be overseeing a larger group of students to ensure compliance? These are really important questions as we think about, and we'll share some of the compliance issues we've had as a state overall. And so we think about bringing on the right expertise at the right level of our system is really going to be critical for us to operate effectively and to ensure that we're delivering high quality education. We also talked about our funding system, and we know that there's really hyper local budgeting decisions that are happening, but that's occurring within a statewide system, a statewide funding pool. That creates distance from the voter that they're making decisions to their taxes. And it also can create challenges as you're making really hard decisions around what to invest in your education for that local community. We've talked about some of the kind of unintended consequences or the peculiarities of the system, and that even if you hold spending tight as a district, your voters could have an increase in property taxes due to a variety of other factors. We also have a lot of variability in education standards. So I think these two bullet points are interesting as we think about local control. So when you think about local control from a budgeting perspective, many districts do not have that control because there are so many statewide factors that are actually impacting the budget that are outside of the local control. When you actually think about educational standards, there's a lot of local control in that regard, where we're developing very unique proficiency-based standards and graduation rates and at districts and making those curriculum decisions. And that's creating a lot of inconsistency in terms of expectations and performance outcomes. It also can take some challenges if you see a student moving from district to district sometimes. And so those are some things that we've heard also from the Listen and Learn for. It can create a lot of extra burden also on districts if they're required to continue to create things from ground up. And again, when we talk about these system issues, it's important to strike the right balance. So we want to make sure that there is that local customization while also ensuring that we're providing the direction and support that can help to make our educators' work really more focused and being able to focus on the creative work as opposed to kind of doing some of the more bureaucratic pieces. And we can talk about that more holistically. We also know that there's a very significant decrease in enrollment. We've shared that there's been over 20% decrease in enrollment in K-12 over the past 20 years. There's been a rise in cost, and we have overall statewide affordability issues. And so when you hear about a lot of the challenges that our schools are managing, they're often reflective of the broader context within which the school is situated. And so, affordability issues around housing and access to mental health and so forth also create significant pressures on schools. We often talk about the term scale and really thinking about the fact that when we have a lack of scale, it can create competition for funding and also tension between districts and career and technical centers and independent schools as you think about providing students with the array of opportunities. Vermont's preference for small schools and small classes
can sometimes constrain program offerings and the ability to hire specialized instructors to provide support in the school. So the impact of some of these system issues is we have a fragile system where many districts struggle to ensure operational continuity. And the agency has been very active in trying to help promote stabilization. Some of this has to do with challenges with actually hiring staff at the central office to be able to support those operations. We also know that we have, a pretty broad school portfolio. And so there's an operational cost for those buildings. And that can divert dollars away from students and limit funding to address deferred maintenance issues and to reinvest those dollars in some of the capital improvement needs. Some of the lack of scale that we see in parts of our state limit opportunities. We talked about that creating competition for dollars. It makes Vermont overall more vulnerable to shifts in federal funding and also state economic changes. We've talked a lot over the last week in terms of inequity. And we know that the term equity captures a lot of different definitions. And we really want to make this very practical when we're talking about equity. It's really equity for students' access to robust course offerings, electives, sports, enrichment opportunities, that well-rounded educational experience that we know Vermonters really value. And that came out really clearly in our Listen and Learn tour. And it came out really clearly in the perspective of students as well, that these are the types of things they are desiring in their education system. The challenges that our schools and districts face are really big and they're very complex. And sometimes it's challenging to actually meet those issues and address them at the local level. And so we've heard a strong call for a partnership with the state and helping to support and address those issues in a way that really builds on the strengths of Vermont and protects what we value most and preserves what's special about our communities.
Before we go into the next slide, which is about the Agency of Education, theoretically, everything to me that you're saying makes sense. That I live in a county where we have 3 unified union school districts that are frankly quite similar. With 3 superintendents, 3 business managers, 3 special education coordinators, all that. There's a lot of repetition. Yet I know that each and every one of those people is incredibly busy and has a full plate. How does one say, oh, well, you really only need 1 superintendent for that, when everybody seems to have a full plate and is very busy?
I think it goes back to really creating a system where you have the right level of support and thinking about positioning that support at the right level of our organization. I've been talking a lot.
Yes.
Annie, some water available?
I can go back to the cafeteria. We're not gonna go back.
I'm doing a water run.
Well, how do you feel about seltzer?
Okay, I don't want to take yourself.
I got a bunch.
She's
Got a whole box.
She's got a box.
Oh, you got it. Oh,
She's got a
yeah,
box.
there we go.
Thank you.
Thank you. She has been talking nonstop for like 3 weeks. Thank you so much.
And I think also, Peter, one thing that we do know about our systems, and this goes back to this idea of local control in some ways, and where it is that we maybe should be valuing that local control versus maybe having more standardization, right? That like unity versus freedom. So just some basic operational things. Our districts have different accounting systems. We've moved to the uniform chart of accounts, but I would say it's work that's not quite finished. And I think districts would agree with that and agency staff would agree with that. So the way that we code things is different. The way that course enrollment data comes in is different because everyone's using different systems. So part of the answer is like basic economies of scale, right? HR systems are different. We actually do have one IEP system, but it doesn't connect to anything. So I think Vermont is also working its way through at the agency level, the district level, through significant technical debt and infrastructure debt. And that creates a lot of extra effort, a lot of duplication of effort. And then at the agency level, it means that agency staff is having to expend a lot of effort just to make the data, comparable and validated. We still have systems that operate on paper files and access databases. And nobody should feel great about that, right? And think about the burden that puts on schools trying to deliver services to the most vulnerable students in their school. Having to deal with paper copies, PDF copies, think about agency staff would like to be providing more technical support on the quality of those services, but are dealing with PDFs, paper copies, access databases. So part of that answer is yes, that, we work with these folks a lot and they are incredibly busy. There are some basic economies of scale that we could achieve. And there is also more, a little less freedom in how everything is done in the districts, and a little more unity would actually save a lot of effort and would allow people to do what they got into education to do, right? Which is teach and innovate and provide, a great educational opportunity to students instead of all of the other things that they often have to do. It's a case sort of like.
I just appreciate that what I think I'm hearing is the agency of ed saying, we might have made a mistake back when we left it up to the teachers to figure out what the standards are.
Yes.
Because
Yes.
that was every time we met, and we met a lot to figure out what our standards were.
Yeah.
Every time we met, the educators in the room sat around and said, this isn't what we should be doing. This
Right.
isn't what we should be doing.
Yeah.
What it looks like here is gonna look something else different there. So when I think about the amount of work and the amount of time that we spent doing that work, it's going to be difficult to flip the switch and
Yeah.
be told, as I think we should have been from the beginning, these are the standards, or not be told, but hopefully you take, teachers will be part of the
Yes.
conversation and figuring out what they are. But I think thinking about it, talking about it, putting it on paper, putting it in a slide, and being thoughtful, moving forward and getting us all on the same page is really exciting for educators in the room. And I think I can speak for several of us.
I've often said when I've been talking to teachers in Vermont is I can't imagine being an early career teacher and having to do the things that we ask Vermont educators and like building leaders to do. Like, I can't imagine my experience as a new teacher back in, but.
That's why they run away in the first
A
time, yeah.
long time ago, and I was doing that training in a different state, and it wasn't prescriptive, thou shalt read X, Y, and Z, but there was a curriculum, and there was teacher mentors, and there was, professional, like that embedded as an early teacher. And I think about what early and mid-career teachers are asked to do in our system in Vermont. It must be incredibly challenging to get into the field doing that work right now, feeling like you have to recreate the wheel and the amount of effort that goes in. I think people underestimate like the amount of effort that goes into reviewing a curriculum and then coordinating it across the system. And what if you have multiple districts within your supervisory union? The amount of effort there, I think we should take a step back and recognize it doesn't actually have to be this hard. And what do you give up as a teacher or a principal or an assistant principal or a curriculum director when you're doing that instead of the focus you can put on kids, which is why people become educators. Yeah.
They probably all lost their voices too. Thank you so much for
We
your
were riffing.
Thank
while
you.
said
Yeah,
your voice
I need
back.
to look at that.
Yeah.
I appreciate that feedback, and that's really what we heard consistently as we had focus groups with educators. It's not an empowering experience. It feels, it's a burden. It's so much work, and it takes our educators away from being able to do what Jill's describing that they love best, right? And so part of this next conversation is how do we support that in a way that provides those tools and resources and then allows the creativity from that, so that they can really reinvest their time also and energy in the ways that they can do best, right? And absolutely, any process that we do with the agency will need to be informed by educators, but we're shifting away from burdening educators with completely generating all of the content.
And that's definitely what we heard. And I want to reflect on kind of the intent of that was a good intent, right? And I think this goes into, there's been some probably historically role confusion and identity questions around what is the role of the agency of education within a local control state? And I think, the idea of empowering our educators and the field to be involved in developing standards is a valuable piece. But what we're describing is we need to have the right balance. And so there's a way for the agency to be able to take that leadership role and create a process and a system to make sure that those recommendations are really reflected by what's important in the field and have an opportunity for vetting. And so that's, as we're talking about the future state, that'll be a shift. But I do want to call out that I think it was well intentioned. It was intended, the role of the agency to really be an empowering, I think, approach. And what we've seen is it's created a lot of confusion and extra work. And sometimes because of the lack of direction, it also creates a lot of frustration. And so one of our focus groups, I remember a principal saying, we don't want you to come in and tell us we're doing it wrong. We want you to show us how to do it right. And then we can all work together and share that across the state. And so that's the type of sentiment that we're hearing when we talk about this. In terms of additional historical context, over 15 years ago, the Agency of Education was, downsized. And so that shifted the focus too, and shifted the type of support provided in the field. We know that we've had some capacity issues to support landmark education legislation. That's something that we have heard from our Listen and Learn tour. And we're really actively responding to that. So we've launched Free Vermont to support the implementation of Act 139 to promote literacy outcomes statewide. And that approach was really designed based on what we heard from our educators and what we heard from the Literacy Advisory Council, which was, we really want support with this. It is such a paradigm shift in terms of how we teach kids to read that we need some help. And we want to do that in a way that is really supportive. And so a lot of Read Vermont is structured to provide job embedded coaching. So it's really we're in the classroom, providing that support, and that's a direct response. That's modeling some of kind of the new ways in which the agency is going to be engaged. Jill really described this very well. We've had antiquated systems and inefficient processes. So Jill touched on some of just kind of the technological pieces, but also there's just inefficiency in the process. So we've looked through kind of we have a very highly bureaucratic system with a lot of different complexity in terms of how we collect information from the field. And that's why you hear us talking a lot about validation, right? There's a lot of different ways that data may be coded, and we have to go through a very rigorous process to validate that. So there's some work we need to do to streamline both our work with the field and also coordination across the agency. What I've noticed as a new leader to Vermont is that there's been a big disconnect between theory and action. There's a lot of really well-intentioned and well-researched initiatives and policy, but there's been a real challenge with implementing that with fidelity. And so that's a big focus for us as we're working with you and you're exploring different policy considerations, really being mindful of what it will take for the agency to support that and monitor and evaluate the outcome of those intended policies. We've shared previously, but there's been a lack of a strategic plan at the Agency of Education. That creates a big challenge as you think about the priorities and how to direct limited resources. So that was one of the first things when I came on board around how do we develop that prioritization? And we need to do that based on input from the field, based on data, which is how the Listen and Learn tour came about. We also have had long-standing compliance issues with the federal government. And, this is, a factor of a lot of some of the complexity that we have. We're kind of overly complex in many areas to be able to deliver on expectations. And so, coming into this role, you've inherited some maintenance in this area around compliance with the federal government. And that has come across in terms of our overall accountability system, special education delivery, supporting parent engagement, a lot of quality indicators that I think we all value. We're struggling and we've had some issues with compliance. And I want to note that this is not for a lack of
trying or a lack of expertise. It's just that we need to really think more intentionally around how we structure ourselves to ensure that we're resourced as a small state to be agile and responsive and impactful. Because to your point, everyone's working really hard in their role, but there's ways to think that we could work smarter to be able to deliver on those outcomes. So as we think about future state, then we are developing a strategic plan, and that plan is designed to promote clarity on priorities. As part of this work, we are looking to realign the agency's support and resources to support those state goals. So we've given you some examples of some key initiatives. As we are working on those initiatives, it's around reprioritizing and bringing teams together to focus on that, because we know that those are immediate needs right now of the field. I think it's also important to note as we talk, establishing the strategic plan and knowing our priorities will be really critically important in kind of creating a very stable and future-proof public education system. I think COVID taught us a lot. You know, during COVID, there was a big infusion of dollars. And I think what we also saw is even though there was access to more dollars, if you didn't have the systems in place to be able to implement some new initiatives, you didn't have the clear prioritization, I think many districts across the country really struggle to figure out how do we best maximize these resources. So for us as an agency to have a really strong strategic plan with real clarity will be helpful in bad times too. And things that we don't expect will come up. We know as a state what our priorities are, and we've got the right system and process and partnerships in place to be able to continue and accelerate in those areas. Moving forward, we're looking to have really strong leadership and support of your state education agencies to make sure that we can help to elevate statewide outcomes. We place a big priority on enhanced data infrastructure and reporting, and you've seen a number of reports coming out. As part of that process, there's a big validation component of that, and we're looking to kind of systematize what we've learned through the validation to ensure that we do have more consistency and we do have more streamlined data collection that isn't overly burdensome. We have already increased our capacity, but bring on some consulting support in this area as it relates to data infrastructure and reporting, and also education finance and budgeting support. And moving forward, we're going to create greater capacity to support academic and curricular needs. So adding some additional high-level positions within the agency to support academics and providing that professional development to the field in a much more targeted way. We are expanding our focus and bringing educators together. We heard that was a big request across the state. Educators talked about the experience of coming together as a region or coming together with schools that have similar needs and being able to share best practices, share what's working, and also identify challenges and think collectively around how you can overcome them. So that's really part of, I think, the exciting work is how we can help to support that type of planning. Again, that's going to be critical for us to, as a state, elevate outcomes and build upon the strengths and what's working really well. Overall, we've talked about there's been really a lack of accountability in key areas. And so we will be making sure that with everything we do, there's a very clear evaluation framework so that we can really monitor our success and that be done in a way that's always supporting continuous improvement. When we shift to a data-driven culture, there's always a concern that data will be weaponized. And so we've been really explicit that data from the Agency of Education is used to drive continuous improvement because we need that as a state to help increase opportunities and outcomes for students in every community. And so with that increased accountability also comes, a real intentional focus on support. And we've heard that loud and clear through our Listen and Learn tour that that's really critical, that we couple that accountability with support because again, it's about making improvements. So that's what you can expect as we're moving forward as an agency and developing our strategic plan and really prioritizing how we support the field and help to promote educational equity. So key takeaways. I think we've ended with all of these key considerations at the end of every presentation because again, we're always thinking about how do we reduce inequities? How do we align funding and resources where they are needed most? How can we create more meaningful opportunities to really engage in that whole child approach? We know that a lot of this is figuring out how do we maximize the dollars we have. And so we are one of the top spenders in education. I would assume we will continue to be one of the top spenders in education, but there are ways that we can reinvest our dollars to have a greater impact in achieving these goals, and making sure also that every child has access to a highly qualified teacher. So these are all the broad considerations that we have that are really informing our policy recommendations, the governor's policy recommendations. So all these considerations move into, the framework that the governor has shared. And really his focus is on strengthening our public education system and recognizing that in order to do this effectively, we really need to take that multi-pronged approach and focus on funding, on governance, on also creating the guardrails that we need to ensure that there is a wise use of our limited dollars. And all of that going into a way that's evidence-based and we know will improve educational quality for our students. So for that, we'll open the questions.
Great, thank you, again, for coming in with a really, sort of cogent and, important background for us. And, really from that, I think we're able to draw themes that we're probably going to hear when the governor makes his presentation of this plan later in the month. And many of those themes are things that people in the education world, whether they're teachers in the classroom or school board members like me or members of this committee or whatever it happens to be, I frankly can get pretty excited about. Maybe you've heard a little excitement right over here. Then I think about the details. And I think about things like reducing the number of supervisory districts and how you then and making larger ones. And those larger ones all of a sudden have mixed governance and mixed delivery models and how you make them all come together. And these are the details that are obviously going to end up sitting right in front of us. So I hope we get as much guidance and thoughtfulness about how that could possibly happen as possible. And I just want to say I violated my own rule about not making statements, but asking questions. Let me say, okay.
I think what you're signaling is, that there's a lot of details with any sort of change process. The state has gone through a lot of changes with education. I think it's an opportunity for us to learn about what worked and what are some things that we could improve upon. And so, with the governor's proposal that he'll be sharing, it's really built on what we've heard. Is really important to Vermonters through our listen and learn, and also, past conversations. These aren't new conversations, but I think everyone's coming together to figure out how do we do this in a way to really achieve the goals for students, and with students really being our North Star. And so, there's a lot of input through the listen and learn tour that the governor has read and reviewed. It's kind of shaping his thinking along with some other ideas that he has, and then there will continue to be input to make sure that all those considerations are brought to bear.
I appreciate that, but we'll be dealing in the areas, in addition to those, is the makeup of this potential school board constitutional? And so there's going to be a lot there. I'm on one hand, frankly, really excited to sort of take all of those things that we have many of us have talked about in theory and putting them into action. When I say, well, what does that really mean? I'm really concerned. Yeah, which is, it's not a reflection on anything other than transformation is challenging, it's complicated. This is making Act 46 look like chicken feed, just in terms of the amount of change. And I'm not saying it's unnecessary. Just preparing all of these folks that it's going to be a lot of homework and a lot of thoughtfulness. Representative Long.
I really appreciate, thank you, first of all, for all of this. And I really appreciated going back to the AOE past and future and the mention in here and by you, Secretary Saunders, about the downsizing of the AOE 15 years ago, and how it shifted things. I wasn't in the legislature 15 years ago, although it's been a long time, but I was on the school board, and I'm trying to remember why that downsizing happened. And do you have any historical perspective? I know this was long before you, but I'm curious as to
As a whole.
And I, just to add on to that before you answer, you know, as well as all of us, that the focus has been, the agency isn't able to fulfill the role for local school districts in the manner in which it is expected. We've been hearing that for a really long time. And the legislature's been very aware of that and we've been trying to resource and staff the agency to a level where it needs to be. So focusing on the future and whatever the next steps will be, how do you foresee changing that and changing the role of the AOE to support the systems that we're going to be studying?
Yeah, I mean, I think these conversations are important to have in the context of the entire public education system for the state of Vermont. And I think what we've highlighted is we have an overly complex system. So that's something that we need to think about. I think it's also really important that, you know, as we talk about changes, it's not just about throwing money or throwing staff at a problem, right? And so what we're trying to do is be really intentional as an agency around, through our strategic planning process, identifying what those priorities are and how we may need to realign our efforts in that process. We certainly, you know, any organization, there's sometimes duplication of efforts. And I think it's really important that we do that internal work and really trying to maximize resources and then think about, are there additional gaps? And so that process should be done in a really thoughtful way that's, I think, very mindful of some of the cost limitations that we have as a state. And it should be done in the overall context. So it's an answer that we need to be evaluating capacity and we need to evaluate that in terms of an overall future state, which I think that the governor talked about in terms of more simplified governance structure, and then be thoughtful about where we still have gaps and then have those conversations.
No reflection on the downsizing.
So I think from that, I wasn't here
Yeah,
then.
of course. I'm just
But
wondering
I
what you
think
heard.
some of that was based on the recession and having to do some downsizing. And I think the more point in that conversation is shifting of focus, right? And so again, it goes back to how do we ensure that as an agency, we're organized in a way to best meet the needs? And so thinking about, you know, as we look through the fragility of our system, there's a lot of extra support that is needed to help stabilize district operations. So part of this whole work should be really strengthening the entire system is what we're thinking through. And so it's hard to make recommendations that are separate just for an agency, right? I think we need to think about the whole and make sure that the entire state education system, as we think about the collective governance, is in a place to really meet the needs. And we've talked about positioning resources in the right place, right? I think that's an important part of that conversation because we know that there are some challenges in being able to recruit highly specialized educators that we really need in order to address some of our compliance issues and to address overall continuous improvement. So I think that needs to be part of that conversation too.
And if I can just add, I want to emphasize that this strategic planning and the development of the strategic plan that's underway within the agency is going to drive that work quite intentionally. And the lack of that plan for a decade, I think 2014 is the last time we had a strategic plan, I think has been to the detriment of these conversations, being able to say specifically, these are, I like to say budgets are an expression of priorities, right? And if we're not very clear on what the agency's priorities are, then it's really challenging to be able to say, we have a gap here. And this is actually something that we all agree upon as a priority, not just for the agency, but for the state education system. And then also, do we have expertise currently within the agency that could be deployed to those priorities? We haven't been able, since I joined the agency, this has been part of the conversation, so it's been almost 5 years. We haven't had the lodestone to help us say, yet. And certainly we all feel in the agency that we are at capacity and beyond. But how do you focus? How do you ask for the right resources? We're doing that right now. And I have a degree of confidence at this moment in time that I didn't say in the past that we're actually going to be able to identify those gaps.
And I would say as secretary, it wouldn't be responsible for me to make recommendations about capacity until we've done this work, right? And that's why we're taking this strategic planning process so seriously, and that we really need to make sure that there's alignment. I also think, you know, as we talked about our role, I think, there's kind of been a conception that or an idea that the agency is responsible only for implementing federal and state laws. And I think even within that context, sometimes there's been kind of a narrow interpretation around what that means. So instead of just federal reporting, those reports are designed to drive quality improvement for states. And so those are the ways that we're kind of shifting and expanding our thinking around what does that mean when we talk about compliance, and how do we actually use those tools and resources to elevate and raise the bar for Vermont.
Just the tiniest follow-up.
Yeah.
Thank you. I really love all the talk about the strategic plan. What's the timeline for that?
Yes, so the listen and learn tour,
I know
we
you're
did more
busy.
listening.
I know you're busy.
Because we actually, it was great. We started and we had a more truncated plan and we got requests to do more. And so that has been extended. Our next steps over the next couple of weeks is we're actually going to have division planning. So we're bringing all of our divisions together. We're reflecting on what we have heard are the priorities, and we're identifying how the core work of each division is aligning to those priorities. And we're also identifying where there are opportunities where we have further alignment, or we might have some additional support needed. And so that's all coming in. So there'll be a strategic plan, but then there'll also be an operational plan for the agency to really make sure that we are fully supporting our core processes that are mission critical, and providing the right leadership support to amplify those efforts.
And just to complicate things, because
Yeah.
why not?
Then we're
The work that we're all doing here also has to inform the strategic plan. So we are walking, chewing gum, patting our head,
flying
and rubbing our
planes all at
bellies
the same time.
all at the same time, but it will be all informed by each other, and then we'll develop the strategic plan from that. So it's urgent work, but it needs to be informed by this work as well.
And so part of what I would also say is I know there's kind of a sense of, getting concrete is at every phase of our learning, we have been doing reports. So we've been signaling what those priorities are. We've been launching new initiatives along the way. So we're not waiting to have everything finalized before we really do the work that we need to do. So we launched with Vermont, for example. We've ramped up our support around strategic budgeting in the field. We're in the process of really trying to accelerate our state assessment reporting, and we're working with the U.S. Department of Education on that. So we can bring that back so that there's clarity around in those areas that we know are more urgent that we can respond to now. We are. And then there's other initiatives that may be longer term that will come through the formal planning process.
Thank you.
Senator Williams?
Just comment, done a really good job, come a long way in a year. And one of the things that you kind of alluded to what I'm gonna make a comment about, but three things that I haven't heard a lot of is standard
Mhm.
and evaluation
Mhm.
and organizational effectiveness. So do you see the AOE fulfilling that role of establishing a standard in your strategic plan for all
Yes.
schools? And knowing that every school is different, they're gonna be, have certain strengths and weaknesses, but, and how are you gonna evaluate that organization in the out years to make sure that they're complying with your guidance?
Absolutely. That is a focus of ours as we're developing this approach. The team often hears me talk about this in terms of defining what are we tight on and what are we loose on. The things that we're tight on, we're going to align our work, we're going to evaluate it, and we're going to make mid-course corrections as needed to ensure that we're achieving those intended outcomes. So that is absolutely part of the plan, and I'm really confident that we'll be able to do that effectively. I think the agency's already demonstrated that we're doing that in really important ways right now.
Representative Hunter and then Senator Heffernan.
In an effort to simplify, to streamline all of what we've been talking about, do you foresee a strategic plan, with 5-year mark, 10-year mark, 20-year mark, right? Because obviously waving the magic wand at this point isn't gonna work.
We need to establish multi-year goals.
Okay.
And we need to be clear about how we get there.
Yep.
Yes.
And I would say it's really, and I think this goes to your point as well, it's critical that we identify how we're going to measure. And that when we are undertaking new initiatives, that we have really clear outcomes and that we're not afraid to measure and say whether or not we are achieving those goals, right? And I think that's something that historically maybe we've been challenged by doing. And so I think that's something that you'll see that shift in culture. And I would say that Zoe has not been afraid to point out the areas where we maybe have weaknesses and need improvement, and then actually take some action to measure. So we're not afraid to measure ourselves, and then also to help support schools. I use this metaphor, so I apologize, Zoe's heard it before. You know, as for the educators in the room, right? You don't measure students on standards that you haven't explained to them, supported them to achieve, and then you measure them, right? And then you understand where you didn't help to support them and you go back, right? And I think that we need to take that approach within the agency, and it's really part of our internal conversation in almost everything we're doing right now. And so I'm pleased to see that moving us.
And I'm proud of the team for taking that approach.
Yeah.
That takes a lot of courage and humility to be able to say, we are going to take a continuous improvement mindset. And if things aren't working exactly as we intended, we're gonna think about how to do it different.
So, thank you, Mr. Chair. So I like usually, and I think you've been looking at it, and try to find the same states that roughly have the same amount of peoples and that, and how they've been doing. And Wyoming has been very, very close to us as, they got 90,000 compared to our 80, give or take numbers. They rank in the top, they've been in the top 5 for 15 years of you know, the highest in education notoriety. Have we looked at what they're doing and see if we can emulate it here in Vermont? Because their cost per student is just under $17,000, where ours is, you know, 21,000. And they're doing what we want to do. They're up in the top 5, and they're spending, you know, less to educate this children.
Yeah, we're actually in the process right now of doing a literature review so that we can share that in more depth. We do have some, you know, high level overviews. We've done an analysis of how we rank compared to other states. And we've also done that as we look at our overall funding system. But we recognize that there's a need to do that deeper dive. So the work is underway. And I would also say, as we look at other states, it's not a scenario where we can take exactly what they're doing and just plop it onto Vermont. But part of what this work is helping us to understand, and what are some of those principles and evidence-based practices that we want to also incorporate in Vermont's system, and then where are there opportunities to customize that for the Vermont context. So I do think it's really helpful for us to be looking at other models in other states. We proactively brought on 2 consultants who are supporting us at the APA that have national perspective. They've worked with a number of different states, and then they also really understand Vermont because they worked really closely both with the Agency of Education and with many districts across the state. And so that's just another resource. We also have national associations that are doing a lot of this comparative analysis and work that we can bring in as well. So yes, and I appreciate that you're doing your research, and if you have specific notes you want to share with us, please do. And then we're happy to bring back additional information that would be helpful.
And I would call us right on time. Thank you very much. We'll be seeing most of you soon.
Yeah, I
Thank
think
you.
we're back on
Back on
Tuesday talking about Cradle